When I remarried, I never told my wife or her son about the $43 million my late wife left me. Thank God I didn't. 3 days later, my stepson showed up with a lawyer. 3 days after my wedding, my new stepson stood on my porch with a lawyer, waiting for me to sign away the house where my first wife died. 6 weeks later, I'd be standing under fluorescent light in a hotel boardroom, 18 floors above uptown Charlotte, watching a banker named Walter Kingsley pick up a single sheet of paper, go completely still, and say the one word that ended my new wife's family for good: fraud. I'm getting ahead of myself. If this is your first time here, welcome to the Neshapomai. Go ahead and hit subscribe now, because by the time this story is over, you're going to want to see exactly what happens to people who mistake a grieving man for an easy mark. And if anyone in your own life has ever treated your kindness like a blank check, or your grief like an opportunity, drop the word boundaries in the comments below. You're going to need it today. My name is Grant Whitfield. I'm 37 years old. For 11 years before any of this started, I built a real estate portfolio with a woman named Eleanor. Small multi-family buildings first, then commercial space, then more money than two kids who grew up sharing bedrooms with their siblings ever expected to see in one lifetime. We built it from nothing, by hand, on weekends, one property at a time. Then Eleanor got sick, and 14 months later, I buried her, and for 4 years after that, I lived by myself in the brick house we'd bought together in Myers Park, doing the math on grief the same careful way I did math on everything else. Quietly, mostly after midnight, and never in front of anyone. I'm telling you all of that so you understand exactly what Vivian Hale thought she married. She thought she'd done her homework. She was wrong by about $38 million. Let me back up to the actual morning it started, because by the time I understood what was happening to me, I was already 3 moves behind. It was a Tuesday, 9:12 a.m. I remember the exact time, because I just glanced at the microwave clock, debating whether it was too early to eat leftover wedding cake for breakfast. Vivian had left the house around 7:30 for what she called an urgent client call. She did crisis PR work for a couple of regional tech accounts, or so she'd told me. And I was still in my robe, sorting a stack of wedding cards on the kitchen counter, enjoying a kind of quiet the house hadn't held in years. The house smelled like the last of the good coffee, and the faint sugar and frosting smell still coming off the cake box on the counter. Sunlight was coming in low and gold through the kitchen windows, the way it did most mornings that time of year. And I remember thinking, in the specific, unremarkable way you think things right before your life changes, that this was probably going to be an ordinary, forgettable day. Then the doorbell camera chimed. I checked my phone. My new stepson, Preston Calder, 20 years old, was standing on my porch in a navy quarter zip that looked more like a boardroom costume than anything a college kid should own on a Tuesday morning. Beside him stood a man I'd never met, gray suit, leather briefcase, hair combed with the kind of precision that costs money. I opened the door halfway. "Morning," I said, still holding my coffee. Preston smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't get anywhere near the eyes, and apologized for dropping by unannounced. Said he'd been in the neighborhood. The man beside him didn't wait to be introduced. He put his hand out and said his name was Desmond Voss. He didn't say friend, he didn't say colleague, he said attorney. There are sentences that improve a Tuesday morning. I brought donuts as one of them. I'm an attorney is never one of them, especially 3 days after your wedding, when the man saying it is standing next to your 20-year-old stepson, who is holding nothing but a phone and a very practiced expression. I asked if I should go put on shoes first. Preston laughed like I'd made a joke. I hadn't. He waved a hand and said it was nothing serious, just some paperwork his mom wanted handled while she was tied up with a client. Voss looked uncomfortable already, shifting his weight from one shoe to the other. I filed that away, because lawyers confident in their own business don't fidget on a stranger's porch. I let them in anyway. We sat at the dining room table, where 3 nights earlier, Vivian and I had opened a ridiculous bottle of champagne after the reception. 2 unopened wedding cards were still propped on the sideboard. Voss set his briefcase down like it belonged there, popped the latches, and slid a thick folder across the table to me. He cleared his throat, and said he understood Vivian had discussed some estate planning with me. "No," I said. "She hasn't." Voss's mouth actually opened, and nothing came out. Preston jumped in fast, the condescension already showing through. Maybe she hadn't mentioned specifics, he said, but it was generally what they'd talked about, for our future as a blended family. He called it routine. Whenever someone tells you that signing legal paperwork is routine, what they're actually telling you is that they're hoping you're too polite to read past the signature line. I opened the folder. Bold letters across the top, Calder Family Holdings LLC. Calder wasn't my name. It wasn't Vivian's married name either. She'd been Hale as long as I'd known her. Seeing her ex-husband's family name printed across the top of a document about my house, 3 days into a marriage where she was supposed to be building something with me, sent one small cold thread of wrongness through the whole morning before I'd even read a single clause. I filed it away next to Voss's fidgeting and kept my face perfectly still. I've closed on enough properties, signed enough loan documents, sat across enough tables from people who wanted my signature more than they wanted my understanding, to know one rule: if somebody's waiting on you to sign, you never start reading at the back page. I flipped to page 1 and started on the actual language, and Voss, realizing I wasn't going to just nod along, launched into a rehearsed pitch about asset protection, estate efficiency, probate exposure. Buzzwords, delivered fast, meant to bury me in jargon before I could ask a real question. I let him finish his whole speech. Then I asked one thing: who owns Calder Family Holdings? Preston answered too fast. His mom's company, he said. Sort of a family trust thing. Voss corrected him, a little too carefully. Vivian was the sole managing member. Preston held a minority interest. And what interest do I hold? I asked. Neither of them answered right away. Preston looked at Voss. Voss looked at the folder. Outside, somewhere down the street, a dog barked twice and stopped, and in the space that opened up after it, the silence in my own dining room got loud enough to hear. The silence answered for them. I leaned forward and told them I wanted to make sure I had this straight. The company had my wife in it. Yes, it had her son in it. Yes, it did not have me in it. Preston sighed like I was the unreasonable one in the room. It's just paperwork, Grant, he said. Nobody's trying to take anything from you. I'd remember that exact sentence a lot longer than he thought I would. I asked Voss flatly what authority Vivian would have over my property once it sat inside that LLC. He chose his words like a man crossing thin ice. As sole managing member, she'd have broad authority under the operating agreement, including the right to restructure the asset. Preston cut in, insisting that wasn't what this was about, that they just wanted to avoid probate taxes down the line. I kept my eyes on the lawyer. Could she sell it? Not without triggering a due-on-sale clause, since there's no mortgage to worry about. Technically, yes, the LLC could sell it outright, Voss admitted, and I watched Preston's jaw tighten at his own lawyer's honesty. Does that broad authority include borrowing against the house? Voss swallowed hard. It did. Mortgages, commercial liens, financing transactions. None of it would require my signature or my consent once the deed moved. So just to be clear, I said, keeping my voice level, almost pleasant, you're telling me that if I sign this, my wife could take out a loan against my house tomorrow, and I would find out about it when the bank called to confirm the wire. Voss opened his mouth. Nothing useful came out of it. Preston reached for his phone. Let me just call my mom. She can explain this better than either of us. She's in a meeting, I said. You told me that already. He froze with the phone half raised, caught in his own excuse, and for a second I watched something genuinely young and unsure flicker behind his eyes before the entitlement slammed back down over it like a shutter. I closed the folder. I did it slowly, and the cardboard made a flat, final sound against the table, a sound I'd hear again in my head more times than I expected in the weeks ahead. I slid it back until it bumped Voss's briefcase. I'm not signing anything, I said. Preston's face went a shade of red I hadn't seen on him before. He said I was seriously doing this without even reading the whole thing, called me paranoid. I told him his reaction was exactly why I wasn't signing it. Voss started repacking his briefcase fast, mumbling something about how I was entitled to have independent counsel review everything, that he was just the messenger here. Preston shoved his chair back hard enough to scrape the hardwood, told me his mother was only trying to protect the family, that I was being selfish, that I was ruining everything. I didn't raise my voice. I told him I thought I was the family. He didn't have anything to say to that. He just left, Voss trailing a step behind him like a man relieved to be leaving a burning building. They were off my porch by 9:47. I locked the door, walked back into a kitchen that no longer felt entirely like mine, and picked up my phone. Harold Bishop answered on the second ring. He'd been my financial attorney for 9 years, and in that time I'd learned exactly 2 things about him. He never returned a fee he thought he'd earned, and he never once told me what I wanted to hear instead of what was true. My stepson just ambushed me with a lawyer and paperwork trying to get the deed to my house, I said, 3 days after the wedding. There was a pause on the line longer than I liked. "Grant," he finally said, "that's early. Even for my low opinion of people." "Tell me it's nothing," I said. "Tell me I'm overreacting to a 20-year-old with bad manners." "I never tell you things just to make the phone call shorter," Harold said. "That's the whole reason you keep paying my invoices, instead of finding somebody cheaper who'd tell you what you want to hear for half the rate." I gave him the LLC name and Voss's card. I told him I wanted everything, filings, associates, every name attached to that entity, and I wanted it fast. "Give me until tonight," Harold said. I hung up and stood in my kitchen for a long time staring at the chair Preston had been sitting in 20 minutes earlier. My hands weren't shaking from fear. They were shaking with the specific cold feeling of watching your entire reality rearrange itself in real time. The wedding cake was still sitting on the counter half-eaten, and for one absurd second, I actually laughed, alone, at the idea that 20 minutes ago my biggest problem had been whether it was too early for cake. I thought the worst of the morning was behind me once I'd gotten them off my porch. I want you to hold on to that thought, because I was about to be wrong about it for the second time before lunch. To understand exactly how much they misjudged me, you need to understand where the money actually came from. Because none of it was ever supposed to make me careless, and for 11 years it didn't. I met Eleanor when I was 22, at a job neither of us liked, in a cubicle 2 rows apart. We were both broke in that specific, exhausting way. Instant coffee, second-hand furniture, a shared feeling that the life we wanted was somewhere just out of reach, and everyone else already had directions. Eleanor was the one who found the directions. She had a mind for real estate and market timing that bordered on unfair. While our friends were financing cars they couldn't afford, we were reading zoning ordinances at her kitchen table, and putting every spare dollar into a joint savings account we weren't allowed to touch for anything but a down payment. Our first purchase was a rundown fourplex on Hawthorne Lane, on the edge of a neighborhood that hadn't decided yet what it wanted to become. I learned to install drywall from midnight videos on a laptop propped on a paint bucket. Eleanor negotiated with contractors like she'd been doing it for 20 years instead of 2 months. We managed the tenants ourselves, fixed our own toilets, drove a Honda with 190,000 miles on it to save on a car payment. By the time we were in our early 30s, that one fourplex had become 11 properties and a small commercial portfolio. And the money had stopped being something we worried about, and started being something we quietly, carefully grew. I tell people now that Eleanor taught me everything I know about leverage. I don't just mean mortgages. I still remember the night we paid off that first fourplex, 4 years early, sitting on the bare living room floor of the unit we'd kept for ourselves, eating gas station pizza off paper towels because we hadn't unpacked plates yet. Eleanor had the payoff letter from the bank spread out on the carpet between us, and she read the balance out loud. 0, in plain type, the most beautiful word either of us had ever seen printed on letterhead, and then she laughed so hard she knocked over her water. We didn't celebrate with champagne. We didn't know yet that we'd ever be the kind of people who could. We just sat there on cheap carpet, greasy fingers and all, feeling richer than either of us had ever felt before or, honestly, would ever feel again in quite the same uncomplicated way. It wasn't all payoff letters and clean wins. Our third property, a 6-unit building we'd stretched hard to buy, nearly sank us the year a pipe burst in a top-floor unit and took out 3 floors of drywall on its way down. We didn't have the reserve to cover it and the mortgage both. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table for 2 straight nights, running numbers. And instead of panicking, she called the contractor herself, negotiated a payment plan he had no obligation to offer her, and picked up a second job doing bookkeeping for a dentist's office 3 mornings a week, until we'd clawed the reserve back. I offered to sell the building at a loss just to be rid of the stress. She looked at me like I'd suggested something genuinely insane, and told me that quitting on a 6-unit building because of one bad pipe was how people stayed poor on purpose. We kept it. 10 years later it was worth 4 times what we paid, and every time I drove past it after she died, I thought about her hunched over that kitchen table with a calculator and a legal pad, refusing to let one burst pipe become the end of anything. "Grant," she told me that first exhausted night, pushing the calculator across the table like a verdict, "a bad month isn't a bad decision. Don't you dare confuse the two." I've repeated that sentence to myself more times in the years since than almost anything else she ever said to me, usually right before I make a decision I'm still a little afraid of. Then she got sick. It wasn't the kind of sick you fight your way out of. It moved fast, and it didn't negotiate. I spent 14 months in hospital rooms that all smelled the same, learning a whole second vocabulary I never wanted: staging, margins, palliative, while the woman who'd taught me how to read a rent roll forgot, near the end, how to hold a pen steady enough to sign her own name. Even then, she made sure everything was protected. Trusts, holding companies, clean paperwork. She organized her own death the way she'd organized every acquisition we ever made. Thoroughly, and 3 steps ahead of anyone who might come looking for a loose end. The last coherent thing she said to me, 2 days before the end, wasn't about any of that. She just squeezed my hand and told me not to let the house get quiet forever. I didn't understand at the time that she meant it as a real instruction and not just a comforting thing dying people say. At the funeral, half the room was people who'd known her for 20 years, and half was people who'd only ever known the version of her that showed up in a closing meeting, sharp, unshakable, 5 minutes early. Renee flew in the night before and never left my side the entire service, which I didn't fully appreciate until years later, watching how differently a room treats you when even one person is standing close enough to catch you if your knees actually give out. A contractor we'd used on 4 different buildings showed up in a suit that clearly hadn't been worn since somebody's wedding, stood at the back the whole time, and left an envelope with $300 in it on the memorial table. No note, because he didn't know what else to do with the feeling. What felt wrong wasn't the crying. It was how many of them kept saying she seemed so healthy the last time they saw her, like health was something you could bank. When it was over, I found myself sitting in an empty house with a net worth that had crossed into 8 figures and absolutely no interest in a single dollar of it. It felt like blood money. I sold off the active side of the business, because I couldn't stand walking through buildings we'd bought together, moved the capital into index funds and municipal bonds where it could sit quietly and not remind me of anything, and disappeared into flannel shirts and a beat-up truck. If you passed me on the street, you'd have guessed I worked a decent, unremarkable job. That was exactly the point. The money was a headstone, not a hobby. There's one thing I never finished, from that year. Eleanor had wanted a reading nook off the kitchen. A window seat looking out at the backyard oaks, nothing fancy, just somewhere to sit with coffee and a book on a Sunday. I started framing it out about 2 months after the funeral, in the middle of the night because I couldn't sleep and my hands needed something to do that wasn't grief. I got the studs up. I never finished it. The lumber sat there, cut to length, gathering dust behind a drop cloth, for 4 years. I didn't know it yet. But that unfinished little room was going to matter again much later, in a way I couldn't have guessed sitting there at 2 in the morning with a box of nails and no plan to ever pick the project back up. It wasn't that I hadn't tried. Before Vivian, Renee had set me up twice with women from her own circle. Both perfectly nice. Both dinners that died somewhere around the appetizer course, because I couldn't stop mentally comparing everything to a marriage that had ended in a hospital room. A coworker's sister took me to a concert once and spent half the night asking careful, gentle questions about what happened to your wife, in a tone reserved for people you suspect might be fragile. I wasn't fragile. I was just very obviously still furnished room by room with someone else's memory, and most people could tell within 20 minutes of sitting across from me. I stopped trying for the better part of a year after that concert, which is exactly the kind of tired, over-explained loneliness a person like Vivian is very good at identifying across a crowded room. 3 years into that particular kind of quiet, my old college roommate Trevor Lang decided it was time for an intervention. Trevor was the connector type, the guy who knew a guy for everything, who'd been trying for months to get me to rejoin the world of the living, his words. He invited me to a small dinner party at his place, 6 or 7 people, low pressure. And I only went because he'd stopped asking and started simply telling me the date and time like it was already decided. That's where I met Vivian Hale. She was 44, 7 years older than me, and she had the kind of unhurried presence that made you forget there were other people in the room. Soft-spoken, put together without looking like she'd tried. She told me she did public relations and crisis communications for a couple of regional companies, and that her son was away starting his 2nd year of college. What struck me most was how she listened. When I mentioned Eleanor, bracing, the way you do, for the usual awkward pivot, Vivian didn't flinch and didn't change the subject. She just put her hand lightly on my forearm and said, "Grief doesn't disappear, it just changes shape until you can carry it without noticing the weight." It was a good line. I'd find out later it wasn't hers. At the time, it was exactly what a lonely man wanted to hear. We started seeing each other. She was patient in a way that felt like consideration, and was actually reconnaissance. She never pushed, never rushed, cooked dinner in my kitchen, and brought the smell of garlic and rosemary back into a house that had been cold for 2 years. She introduced me to Preston not long after, and at 19 he played the part of the respectful, ambitious young man with real skill. Firm handshake, called me sir without being told to, asked genuine-sounding questions about how I'd built the portfolio. I was so hungry for a family again that I let every small red flag pass without a second look. I remember one Saturday in particular, about 4 months into dating Vivian, when Preston asked if he could come by and pick my brain about a real estate class he was taking. Cap rates, net operating income, the actual math behind the theory his professor was skimming over. We sat at my kitchen table for 2 hours with a legal pad between us, while I walked him through how Eleanor and I had underwritten our first fourplex, and he asked sharp, genuinely engaged questions, the kind that made me think for one entire afternoon that I might actually get to be somebody's mentor again. He thanked me on his way out, shook my hand instead of doing the half-hug college kids do, and told me it meant a lot that I'd take the time. I believed every second of it. I still think, honestly, that some percentage of that afternoon was real. That a 20-year-old can be a fast, willing student and a con artist's apprentice in the same body on the same day, and not even fully understand which one he's being. If you've ever fallen for someone right after losing someone else, if you know that particular hunger to feel like a normal, ordinary, ungrieving person again, you already know exactly how easy this next part is to fall for. Comment the word familiar if you do, because you're not the only one, and neither was I. There were signs. I just filed every one of them under a different, gentler explanation, the way people do when the alternative explanation would cost them something they've already decided they want. The first one was small. About 2 months in, over a conversation that had started out being purely about city zoning changes near my office, Vivian asked, almost lightly, how exactly my house's deed was titled, sole ownership, or something more complicated. I told myself she was just a naturally curious person with a head for logistics. The second one landed with a little more weight. She asked, one evening while helping me sort mail at the kitchen counter, whether Eleanor and I had ever set up anything formal for how the properties were held. Trusts, LLCs, anything like that, framed as harmless small talk about how complicated estates could get. I gave her a vague answer and changed the subject, and told myself, again, that it was just her PR brain. Always cataloging structure. The third one I almost caught in real time and let go anyway. I came downstairs one night to find her on her laptop at the dining table, and she closed it a half-second faster than a person closes a laptop for no reason at all. When I asked what she was working on, she said a client deck, and smiled, and I chose to believe the smile over the half-second. The fourth one came from Preston, not Vivian, though I didn't clock the connection until much later. He asked me, casually, over the legal pad afternoon I mentioned earlier, whether Eleanor and I had ever used an LLC structure for the rental portfolio. Phrased like ordinary classroom curiosity, about how experienced investors protected themselves. I answered honestly, walked him through the pros and cons, and felt, for one proud afternoon, like a mentor instead of a mark. It didn't occur to me until I read that email chain, months later, that I might have been the one teaching the exact vocabulary that eventually got used against me. Something wasn't quite right. I noticed it. I just didn't let myself finish the sentence. Then there was Thanksgiving, 5 months in, at Trevor's place, where I met Vivian's mother for the first time. Rosalind had eyes like a hawk doing an appraisal and a smile that never fully arrived. She cornered me by the dessert table and, without much preamble, informed me that a real husband shares everything with his wife, regardless of when it was acquired. A man who keeps separate accounts is already halfway out the door, she told me, jabbing a dessert fork in my direction for emphasis. He just hasn't admitted it to himself yet. She used the word commingling 4 separate times in about 90 seconds, which is 3 more times than most divorce attorneys use it in an entire deposition. There was something underneath the lecture that felt less like advice and more like an old scar being pressed on. A bitterness that didn't quite match the occasion. I noticed it. I didn't understand it. I wouldn't understand it for almost a year. Vivian apologized for her mother in the car afterward, a few careful tears, swore she only cared about my heart and hated even talking about money because it ruined the romance of things. I believed her because believing her was so much easier than being alone again. My sister Renee never fully bought any of it, and to her credit she said so early, before I wanted to hear it. Renee flew in for a long weekend not long after that Thanksgiving, and over dinner on my back patio, she watched Vivian for most of the meal without saying much. The same quiet, cataloging look she used to give job candidates back when she still ran her own logistics company. After Vivian left for the night, Renee stayed out with the last of a bottle of wine and asked, carefully, how much Vivian actually knew about what Eleanor and I had built together. Not much, I told her. By design, the trusts, the structure, the usual reasons. Renee nodded slowly. She listens to you like she's taking notes, she said. I'm not saying that's a bad thing on its own. I'm saying pay attention to what she eventually does with them. I told her she was being protective in the specific way older sisters overcorrect for, especially the ones who'd watched a brother disappear into grief for 4 years, and didn't want to see it happen a second time. I wasn't wrong that she was protective. I was wrong that it meant she was wrong about anything else. Renee didn't push it again after that weekend. She came to the wedding, hugged Vivian warmly enough that I never once suspected she still had reservations, and only told me much later, after everything, that she'd spent most of the reception hoping she'd simply misread a woman who was still working through her own complicated history. She hadn't misread anything. She'd just been outvoted by how badly I wanted to be wrong. When we got engaged, Harold, predictably, insisted on an ironclad prenuptial agreement. I brought it up to Vivian with real guilt, like I was smuggling a lawyer into our relationship. She didn't flinch. She agreed instantly, told me she wanted me to feel completely secure, that she never wanted my past to cast a shadow over our future. Her own attorneys pushed back a little on the alimony language, until Trevor, my supposed friend, the man who'd introduced us, pulled me aside at a bar one night, bought me a scotch, and told me to stop letting paranoid lawyers ruin a good thing. He said Vivian was the best thing to happen to me since Eleanor, and that a man could think his way out of every good decision if he tried hard enough. I took his advice. The prenup was signed without a fight, though not without one last push. Vivian's attorney, a sharp-tongued woman who clearly billed by the syllable, tried for 2 weeks to get a clause added guaranteeing Vivian a minimum settlement, regardless of fault. In the interest of fairness for a marriage of unknown duration, as she put it in an email, Harold forwarded me with a single line of commentary, absolutely not. Vivian herself never once brought it up to me directly, which in hindsight was its own kind of tell. A woman with nothing to hide about her own intentions might have asked why I was being so careful, instead of simply waiting to see whether her lawyer could win the point without her fingerprints on the request. Because of how the prenup was structured, my exact net worth was never disclosed to Vivian directly. The financial disclosures were handled attorney to attorney, in broad ranges, and because most of my holdings sat inside trusts and companies that didn't carry my name, Vivian knew I was comfortable. She knew the house was paid off. She had no idea it was paid off with cash left over that could buy the house 40 times. I remember the moment she signed the prenup, in Harold's conference room, using a slim gold fountain pen her mother had given her for her first PR job. She carried that pen everywhere, kept it in a soft leather sleeve in her purse like it meant something. She signed with a flourish, capped it, and looked up at me like she'd just proven something. I thought, at the time, that she was proving her love. She was proving her patience. The morning of the wedding, before the caterers arrived and before I'd even put on the suit hanging in its garment bag on the closet door, I drove out to the cemetery by myself, telling Vivian I needed to pick something up. I stood at Eleanor's grave for a while in jeans and an undershirt, feeling foolish and necessary at the same time, and told her out loud that I was trying to build a life again, and that I hoped she'd understand rather than mind. I didn't get an answer, obviously. I hadn't really expected one. I just wanted to say it somewhere she could theoretically hear it before I said it to a room full of witnesses instead. The wedding itself was small, 40 guests, a stone chapel, a reception in a restored mill building downtown. Preston gave a toast that got a genuine laugh out of the room, something about how his mother had finally found someone who could out-stubborn her at Scrabble. Rosalind cried, or performed crying convincingly enough that I couldn't tell the difference, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief that matched her dress a little too precisely for something spontaneous. Vivian looked at me during our first dance like I was the answer to a question she'd been asking for a long time, and I remember thinking, in that specific unguarded way you think things at your own wedding, that I'd gotten lucky twice in one lifetime, which almost nobody does. There was a man near the bar most of the night I didn't recognize, older, well-dressed, who Vivian introduced as an old family friend helping with Preston's tuition planning when I asked. I shook his hand, thanked him for coming, and thought nothing more of it. It was only months later, looking at a photograph from that night, that I recognized him as Dominic, standing 11 feet from the cake, watching the whole performance from a comfortable, invisible distance, already counting on the exact ending he thought he was watching get engineered in real time. I didn't know yet that I'd gotten the timeline backwards. The question had already been answered, I just hadn't been shown the math. We didn't go anywhere for a honeymoon right away. Vivian had client deadlines, or said she did, and I had a closing I couldn't move. So the first 2 days of the marriage were just us, in the house, doing nothing more dramatic than reheating leftover reception food and falling asleep on the couch, halfway through a movie neither of us finished. On the second night, she fell asleep with her head on my chest, and I lay there a long time afterward, wide awake, thinking that this particular kind of unremarkable, boring domestic peace was the entire thing I'd been trying to get back to for 4 years. I remember being almost embarrassed by how happy something so small made me. I've thought about that night more than almost any other single memory from the whole marriage, mostly because I still can't decide whether any part of it was real for her, or whether I was simply watching a very good actress rest between scenes. 3 days later, her son was standing on my porch with a lawyer. I tried calling Vivian 4 times that day, straight to voicemail every time, which she later explained as back-to-back client calls, a phrase that was starting to do a lot of work in our marriage. Harold called at 6:40 that evening, right as I heard her car pull into the driveway. I pulled the state filings for Calder Family Holdings, he said, and something in his voice had gone flat in a way I hadn't heard from him before. You want to know when your wife registered this LLC? Tell me. 16 days ago. 16 days before she married you. I didn't say anything for a second. I was doing the math without wanting to. She wasn't your wife yet, Harold said. She wasn't even legally anything to you yet, and she was already sitting in an attorney's office, building the exact mechanism to take your house. As the sole managing member, she'd have had unchecked authority to leverage it. Loans, liens, lines of credit, all without your signature, ever again. If you'd signed what Voss handed you, your house would have become collateral for whatever she's actually funding. Keep digging, I told him. I want every name connected to her money. I want to know what she's building and why she needed my house to build it. I hung up and stood in the kitchen a long time. The flowers from the wedding were still alive in their vases. The cards were still unopened on the sideboard. None of it looked like my house anymore. It looked like the scene of something that hadn't finished happening yet. That was the moment I stopped being confused and started being useful to myself again. Vivian walked in at 6:40 on the nose, balancing a paper bag from the Italian place I liked, and her leather tote on the other shoulder, calling out a bright hello like the morning had never happened. I'd spent the hours since Harold's call sitting at that same island, not eating, not moving much, running through exactly how I wanted the next 10 minutes to go. I'd built enough negotiations in my life to know that the person who reacts first usually loses the room, and I intended, for once, to let her walk all the way into a room I'd already finished furnishing. Peace offering, she said, setting the bag on the island. Garlic bread. My favorite. It was a genuinely unfortunate choice of words. I stayed on the bar stool, watching her unpack containers with the same practiced ease she did everything. Peace offering for what? I asked, keeping my voice level. She paused, just a flicker, a crease between her eyebrows, then leaned over and kissed my cheek. I didn't flinch, though something in me wanted to. For being gone all day, 3 days after our wedding, she said. Work was an absolute nightmare. I brought the Caesar salad with extra croutons the way you like it. Did anything unusual happen today? Not really. She sighed, theatrical, pouring 2 glasses of red. Just endless complaints from the marketing team. Why? Did you finally open the rest of the cards? I let the silence sit there until it got heavy enough to notice. Then I reached beside me, picked up the folder Voss had left, and set it on the island next to her wine glass. It landed with a flat, definitive sound I recognized. Your son brought a lawyer to my house this morning, I said. She went still. The container of pasta hung in the air for exactly 1 second too long before she set it down. Preston came by? Her voice climbed half an octave. Grant, I have no idea. His name was Desmond Voss. I assume you know him, considering your name is all over the operating agreement as sole managing member. She closed her eyes, rubbed her temple like a migraine had just arrived on cue. Oh, that boy. I told Preston we needed to get some basic estate things organized eventually. I never told him to bring a stranger to our house 3 days into our marriage. He's so eager to prove he understands business, he must have run ahead of what I actually said. That's interesting, I said, because he seemed pretty confident you sent him. He specifically told me you warned him I'd get emotional about the house, so he should just push me through it. Her mouth thinned into a line I hadn't seen before. He's twisting my words to cover for his own impatience. Can we please just eat before it gets cold? I'll call the lawyer tomorrow and sort out whatever mess Preston made. We're sorting it out now. I slid the formation page across the counter until it hit her plate. What is Calder Family Holdings? She gave me a small, patient smile, the kind a teacher gives a slow student. It's exactly what it looks like. A vehicle for consolidating some family assets. My advisor suggested it. For estate planning, liability protection, taxes. It's routine for people in our bracket. If it's a family holding company, I said, why is my name nowhere on it? Why are you the only manager with unlimited borrowing authority, and Preston the only other name on it at all? Where exactly do I fit into this family protection? It's a draft, Grant. You're getting hung up on a rough draft that wasn't supposed to be printed yet. Why did the rough draft have a signature page asking me to sign over the deed to a house I already own outright? She crossed her arms. Because eventually I thought it would be smart to put the house in a protected trust for us, so the government doesn't take half of it if something happens to either of us. You thought, I repeated. Yes, I thought. Her voice cracked upward sharp. I was going to bring it up this weekend, over dinner, like adults. Preston jumped the gun trying to prove something to his father. I'll deal with him. You're making this into something it isn't. I didn't look away. I tapped the date printed at the top of the filing twice and slid it closer to her face. Read the date. She looked down. Her jaw worked once, hard enough that I saw the muscle move. 16 days, I said quietly. You filed this 16 days before you married me. You weren't my wife yet. You weren't legally anything to me yet, and you were already building the mechanism to take my house. Something in her cracked, and cracked fast. The irritation dissolved into tears so quickly it was almost impressive to watch professionally. She reached for my hands. I pulled them back. You're completely misreading this, she said, voice breaking on cue. I was trying to protect us. I know what losing Eleanor did to you, how much you've been through with probate and lawyers already. I wanted everything settled so we'd never have to worry. I did it because I love you. You love me so much, you built a mechanism to control my house without telling me it existed. It was going to be a wedding gift, she said, sobbing now, and I watched her cry with a strange clinical distance, like I was watching someone else's marriage fall apart from behind glass. A way to show you I was committed to managing our future so you could just relax. I want the LLC dissolved, I told her. Tomorrow morning, first thing. If it was really built to protect us, and I'm telling you as your husband I don't want it, it shouldn't be hard to destroy. She hesitated for exactly 1 second, long enough that I noticed, before she looked down at the counter and said, Of course, if that's what you want. I just want you to feel safe, Grant. I promise. Nobody's trying to take anything from you. I went completely still. Nobody's trying to take anything from you. The exact same sentence her son had used on my porch 9 hours earlier, word for word, like she'd handed him a script and then forgotten she'd written it herself. I don't think she even noticed she'd said it. That's the part that told me everything. It wasn't a lie she'd built for this moment. It was a line she kept in rotation. I stood up, pushed my chair in. Where are you going? She asked, reaching for my sleeve. We haven't eaten. I lost my appetite, I said. I'm sleeping in the guest room. Give me some space. I locked the door, sat on the edge of an unfamiliar bed in the dark, and let my heart rate come down slowly, on its own schedule. Vivian thought her tears had reset the board. She thought a promise to dissolve a company would buy her a weekend. Somewhere down the hall, I could hear her moving around the kitchen, running water, doing the dishes from a dinner neither of us had actually eaten, performing a normal evening for an audience of exactly no one, since I was already behind a locked door, and she had no idea I could still hear every deliberate, careful sound of it. She had no idea I already knew she was stalling. I called Renee before I tried to sleep, mostly because I needed to say the whole thing out loud to someone who wasn't billing me by the hour. She listened without interrupting, which for Renee is its own form of restraint, and when I finished, she was quiet for a second before she said, I wanted to be wrong about her so badly. I told her so did I. She offered to fly in that weekend. I told her not yet, that I needed a few more days before I had anything worth her flying in for, and that when I did, I'd want her there for the part that actually mattered, instead of the part that was still just paperwork and dread. What I didn't know yet, what I wouldn't understand for another 11 days, was exactly how much money she was stalling to protect, or how many people were standing behind her, quietly running out of time. I didn't bother making coffee the next morning. I left before Vivian stirred and drove straight to Harold's office, downtown, the sun barely up over the skyline. He was already at his desk, tie loosened, 2 crushed coffee cups and a stack of printouts in front of him, looking grimmer than I'd ever seen him. He didn't say good morning. He just slid a thick red folder to the edge of the desk. "Sit down," he said. "I didn't sleep much last night. And after this, neither will you." I sat. The folder sat between us, like something that might go off. "Your wife," Harold said, "and her son are up to their necks in a commercial real estate project on the east side. It's called Ridgeview Commons, an old office park they bought a little over a year ago, planning to convert it into luxury apartments and street-level retail." He tapped a glossy photo of a half-finished building, wrapped in chain link. "Construction's stalled. Their anchor retail tenant pulled out 3 months ago. Costs are up almost 40% over projection." "Vivian works in PR," I said. "Crisis communications for tech clients. She's never once mentioned real estate." "That's because she isn't doing this alone." He pulled another sheet free. "Look at the ownership stack on the development entity." I scanned the columns. Vivian's name, Preston's name, and above both of them, holding the majority stake and listed as lead developer, Dominic Calder. "Her ex-husband," I said, "Preston's father. The whole happy, previously divorced family, reunited by a shared cash flow problem." Harold leaned back. "And here's the number that matters. Ridgeview needs $2,850,000 in the next several weeks, or the primary lender forecloses and the whole thing goes to auction. Dominic's out of collateral. His investors are threatening to pull out. He needs a guarantee, fast, and it has to be something the bank will actually accept." I felt the floor tilt slightly under a thought I didn't want to finish forming. "My house." "Your house," Harold said. "Free and clear, in a stable market, worth more than double what they need. If it moves into that LLC, they don't even need to sell it. They just pledge it as collateral, secure the bridge loan, and keep the project alive. You were never being asked to help plan an estate. You were being recruited as a guarantee. How far behind is he on the existing loans?" Harold checked another page. 91 days on the senior note, 62 on a mezzanine piece he took from a private lender in Charlotte, who does not, from what my investigator gathers, have a reputation for patience. Dominic's been personally guaranteeing pieces of this for over a year on assets he doesn't actually have anymore. Your house wasn't a nice-to-have for him, Grant. It was the only thing standing between him and a very ugly kind of collapse. "It gets worse," Harold said, and slid one more page across. The way he'd gotten it was its own small story. Harold's investigator, a soft-spoken former auditor named Curtis Boyle, who looked more like a tax preparer than anyone who'd ever surveilled a target, had spent 2 days doing nothing more dramatic than eating lunch at the sandwich shop across from Dominic's office. On the second day, he struck up a conversation with a woman on her break, Denise, an office manager who'd been unpaid for 6 hours of overtime 3 weeks running, and had reached the specific stage of resentment where loyalty stops feeling like a virtue and starts feeling like a tax. Boyle didn't lie to her, Harold said. He told her plainly he was looking into her employer, on behalf of a client, and asked if anything crossed her desk that troubled her. It turned out plenty had. For a consulting fee that Harold's firm paid in cash and never itemized, Denise forwarded an internal email thread she'd been quietly sitting on for weeks, unsure what to do with it, and increasingly certain it was going to matter to somebody eventually. It was a printed email thread, the kind of thing that takes either a subpoena or a very motivated assistant with an unpaid overtime grievance to obtain. And Boyle had found exactly that kind of assistant. Harold mentioned, almost as an aside, that Boyle's entire fee for the 2 days of sandwich shop surveillance and the cash payment to Denise had come to less than $4,000. A laughably small number set against what it had just proven, and one more small reminder that the truth, when you finally go looking for it properly, is very rarely as expensive as the lie built to hide it. I read the emails twice. The first was from Preston to his father, copied to Vivian, dated 6 weeks before my wedding. "Dad, the bank's not going to wait much longer on the interest payments. Are we sure Mom's guy is solid for the collateral?" Dominic's reply, an hour later, "Relax. He's a grieving widower with no family and no backbone. Once the ring's on, he'll loosen up. Start with the house, it's paid off, and the equity covers the bridge loan on its own. If he pushes back, let your mother handle him." Then Vivian's reply, 4 lines, sent the same afternoon. "Dominic's right. Grant trusts me completely. He practically eats out of my hand. Get the LLC ready with Voss, but don't push it until the ring is actually on and the certificate's filed. Even if his first wife only left him $5 or $6 million, it's enough to save Ridgeview and get us all clear. There was a fourth message beneath it, sent 2 weeks later from Dominic to Voss directly, copied to no one. Draft the operating agreement so Vivian holds sole managing authority, no exceptions, no co-signer requirement. We only get one shot at the signature. Make sure nothing in the language requires his consent for financing after the fact. It was, in its own way, the most damning line in the entire thread. Proof that the LLC's structure hadn't been a careless oversight or a rushed draft, the way Vivian had sworn to me at my own kitchen island. It had been engineered, clause by clause, by a lawyer taking direct instructions from the one person in the whole scheme I'd never even met before that morning on my porch. $5 or $6 million. I read that line a third time, then a fourth, until the letters stopped meaning anything and just sat there on the page like a joke I hadn't been told yet. There's a specific, quiet violence to finding out exactly how someone priced you. Not that they lied. People lie. I'd made peace with that possibility the day I signed the prenup. It was the number itself. $5 or $6 million. 11 years of Eleanor's spreadsheets. Every burst pipe, every 2 a.m. drywall video, every dollar we didn't spend on a vacation so we could spend it on a roof instead. All of it reduced, by two people who'd never once asked me a real question about any of it, to a rough estimate scrawled at the bottom of a plan to save somebody else's failing office park. I sat there in Harold's leather chair, and felt something in my chest go very still and very cold, the specific stillness of a decision being made below the level of conscious thought. I didn't scream, I didn't throw anything. I started laughing, a low, hollow sound that surprised even me, echoing off the glass in Harold's office. "You okay?" he asked, and I could see him actually wondering if I'd cracked. "They think Eleanor left me $5 million, I said. A slow smile spread across my face, and it did not feel like happiness. "They think that's the whole prize." And Trevor, my college roommate, the man who'd introduced us, who'd pulled me aside at a bar and told me to stop letting lawyers ruin a good thing, I already knew, without being told, exactly what he'd gotten out of steering me toward Vivian. A man doesn't fight that hard for someone else's romance for free. "There's more than enough here to file for fraud and walk away clean tonight," Harold said, standing, joining me at the window. "Lock the accounts, serve papers, let the prenup do its job. She can't touch a dime of yours." "No," I said. "That's too easy. If I serve her tonight, she cries, blames Dominic, and finds some other lonely man in 6 months who doesn't have a lawyer like you." I watched the city wake up below us, cranes and glass and a river of headlights. They need collateral to save this project, and they're actively pitching lenders on the promise that my house is coming. I want to know exactly when and where they make their final pitch, the date, the hotel, the room number. Harold's eyes lit with something close to admiration. "You want to watch it collapse in front of the person deciding whether to write the check." "I want them standing in that room believing they've already won," I said, "when I walk in and take it apart in front of the one person whose opinion actually costs them money." Harold rubbed the bridge of his nose, the way he did when he was about to disagree with a client without losing the client. "It's riskier. If Kingsley's already funded the bridge by the time we get there, we're arguing after the fact instead of before it." "Then we make sure we're not late," I said. "Find out when they're meeting. I'll be ready before they are." If you've ever found out that someone's kindness toward you had a dollar figure attached to it the whole time, you already know there's a specific kind of calm that shows up after the shock burns off. It isn't peace, it's clarity. Comment the word ledger. If you've ever felt that exact shift, the moment grief turns into a plan. I walked out of Harold's office into a bright, ordinary morning. No longer the grieving widower looking for a family to belong to. Eleanor had taught me how to build something from nothing. It was time I remembered how to defend it. Before I went home and put the performance back on, I drove out to see Ridgeview Commons for myself. I told myself it was due diligence, the same instinct that made me walk every property myself before I'd ever sign a purchase agreement. Really, I think I just needed to see the thing with my own eyes before I let it become an abstraction in a folder. It sat on the east side, past a stretch of tire shops and a shuttered strip mall, an old 2-story office park wrapped in chain link and faded orange netting. A single crane stood motionless over half a parking lot torn up for foundation work that had clearly stopped mid-pour. Rebar cages sitting exposed in the weather. a stack of unopened lumber gone gray from sitting through at least one full season of rain. A weathered banner zip-tied to the fence still read Ridgeview Commons. Luxury living, coming soon, the corner of it torn loose and flapping. No workers, no trucks, just a security guard in a folding chair by the gate, playing a game on his phone, guarding a project that had nothing left worth stealing. I sat in my truck across the street for close to 20 minutes, engine off, just looking at it. It was strange, standing that close to the exact thing my house was supposed to disappear into. Not a metaphor, not a number on a page, but an actual half-built husk of a building with somebody's unfinished ambition frozen inside it. I thought about the 11 years it took Eleanor and me to turn one fourplex into a real portfolio, done slowly, on our own money, room by room. Dominic had tried to build something twice that size in under 2 years, on borrowed money and other people's collateral, and it had come apart exactly the way things come apart when the foundation is somebody else's signature instead of your own labor. I didn't get out of the truck. There was nothing there I needed to touch. I just needed to know, for certain, in my own body, and not just on paper, exactly what I'd almost handed over, without ever being told what it was for. At one point the security guard noticed me sitting there and walked over, tapping on my window with a friendly, bored curiosity. I told him I was a broker scouting the area for a client, which wasn't technically a lie. He shrugged and said there hadn't been a crew on site in 6 weeks, that he mostly just sat there so the insurance company could say somebody was watching the fence. I thanked him, and he wandered back to his folding chair, entirely unaware that he'd just confirmed, in one bored sentence, everything Harold's red folder had spent all morning telling me in writing. Then I drove home, and put the performance back on. On my way back, I stopped by a monthly investor lunch I usually skipped, mostly because I needed to sit in a room full of ordinary, unremarkable business for an hour. I mentioned Dominic Calder's name to an older commercial broker named Walt Pretty, careful to frame it as idle curiosity about a stalled project on the east side. Pretty actually laughed, not kindly. "Calder," he said, shaking his head over his coffee. "Man's been 3 deals from bankruptcy for as long as I've known him, always one signature away from saving himself. Nobody in this room will take his calls anymore. You didn't hear that from me, but you also didn't need to. Half the county could have told you the same thing if you'd asked." "What about his ex-wife?" I asked, keeping my voice as flat as I could manage. "Vivian, you know anything about her?" Pretty shrugged. "Not really my world, PR types. I know she stuck around the divorce a lot closer to Calder's business than most exes bother to. Some people just can't fully let go of a bad deal, I guess, even after the paperwork's signed." He had no idea, saying it, exactly how much weight that sentence was carrying for me. I thanked him for the coffee, and left before he could ask why I was so interested. I hadn't asked. That was the part that stung on the drive home. Not that people knew, but that it had never once occurred to me, in 14 months of dating and marrying his ex-wife, to ask a single person in my own industry whether the name Dominic Calder meant anything. I'd underwritten strangers' 6-unit buildings more carefully than I'd underwritten my own family. For the next 4 days, I gave the best performance of my life. I moved my clothes back into the master bedroom. I kissed Vivian's cheek before she left for her client meetings. I sat across from her at dinner, and listened to invented complaints about a marketing department that didn't exist in the shape she described it. And the entire time, my phone sat in my pocket buzzing quietly with updates from Harold. Vivian made a show of it the morning after our fight. Sat at the island, put Voss on speaker, and instructed him, in front of me, to halt all filings on Calder Family Holdings. She squeezed my hand afterward, and told me my peace of mind mattered more to her than any tax strategy ever could. Harold's investigator had already confirmed she'd called Voss back on a second line an hour before that performance, instructing him to place a temporary administrative hold, not a cancellation, and to give her, in her own words, a few days to get his guard down. She was still quietly shopping the deed to 2 other regional lenders as a guaranteed, soon-to-transfer asset. Dominic was using the promise of my unencumbered house to keep his own investors from bolting. On the second of those 4 days, I drove out to see my accountant, a careful, unflappable woman named Priscilla Odom, who'd handled my books since before Eleanor died. I didn't tell her the whole story yet. Just asked her calmly to walk me through every account, every trust, every piece of paper that had my name or Vivian's name anywhere near it, and to flag anything that had moved or been accessed in the last 6 months that I hadn't personally authorized. She called me back 2 days later, on the morning of the boardroom meeting itself, while I was still getting dressed. "Everything's clean," she said. Nothing's moved that shouldn't have. Whatever's going on, Grant, they never actually got their hands on anything. I thanked her and told her I'd explain everything soon. She said she'd wait, in the patient, unbothered tone of a woman who'd clearly already guessed the shape of it, and was too professional to ask twice. Everything else Eleanor and I built was exactly where we'd left it, untouched, unbothered, waiting for me to still be the kind of person who noticed if it wasn't. On the third day, almost as a test of my own steadiness, I closed on a small strip mall acquisition I'd been negotiating for months, entirely unrelated to any of this. The seller's broker, a nervous first-timer, tried to push a last-minute concession on the closing costs an hour before signing, clearly hoping I was too distracted by wedding stuff, as he put it, to notice. I wasn't distracted. I walked him through the original terms line by line, calmly, the way I always had, and he backed down within 5 minutes. It was a strange, useful thing to discover in the middle of everything else, that I could still be exactly as sharp with a stranger's contract as I'd apparently failed to be with my own marriage, and that the second thing didn't have to mean I'd lost the first. To keep the illusion alive, Vivian suggested couples counseling. She framed it as a mature, proactive step, a way to protect our communication after the misunderstanding with Preston. It was, I'll admit, a genuinely good move on her part. Nothing proves a devoted wife faster than dragging her reluctant husband to therapy to work on the relationship. Dr. Miriam Ashcroft's office was soundproofed within an inch of its life, all soft gray walls and a single window that let in exactly enough light to feel clinical rather than warm. She had the unnerving habit of letting silence sit in a room until someone filled it just to make it stop. I sat on the couch beside Vivian, close enough that our knees nearly touched, and thought about how strange it was to be performing a marriage in front of a professional trained specifically to notice performances. If she noticed mine, she never let on. Her attention, at least at first, stayed almost entirely on Vivian. "Tell me about the tension around the house," she said, in a tone that made it sound like a minor scheduling conflict. Vivian went first, hand pressed to her chest, voice trembling at precisely calibrated intervals. "I was only trying to secure our future, Dr. Ashcroft. Grant carries so much weight from losing his first wife. I've seen how messy inheritance and probate can get. I lived through it with my own parents, and I wanted to build something clean and protected so he'd never have to worry about it again. My son handled it clumsily, and now I feel like I've ruined the best part of our marriage by trying to be responsible." Dr. Ashcroft turned to me. "Grant, do you experience Vivian's intent as malicious or as protective with poor execution?" I looked at Vivian. She was doing genuine, focused work with her eyes. Soft, wounded, patient. I chose my next words the way I choose language in a contract. "I think," I said slowly, "that Vivian is deeply invested in financial security, and that she involves her ex-husband and her son in that planning more than she involves me, her actual husband." Her posture stiffened, just a millimeter. "That isn't fair, Grant. Dominic and I only communicate about Preston's tuition. I don't discuss our marriage with my ex-husband. That would be completely inappropriate." Dr. Ashcroft made a small note, unreadable from where I sat, and asked one more question, mild as the rest. "Vivian, if Grant asked you today to walk away from the LLC entirely, not pause it, not restructure it, just end it, would that be something you could do without resentment?" "Of course," Vivian said, a half-second too fast, the same half-second I'd clocked on her laptop weeks earlier. "It was never about the company, it's about protecting him." It took everything I had not to take the printed emails out of my jacket pocket right there, lay them on the glass coffee table, and watch her explain that sentence to a licensed professional. "I didn't," I said. "Instead, that trust was everything in a marriage, and once you found out someone was keeping serious financial secrets, it was almost impossible to rebuild." Dr. Ashcroft closed her notepad and looked between the two of us for a moment longer than the session strictly required. "I'll say one thing before we stop," she said. "Trust isn't rebuilt by one person promising harder. It's rebuilt by watching what actually changes in the next 30 days. I'd pay close attention to that, both of you, more than to anything either of you says in this room." I thanked her, meaning it more than she probably assumed. Vivian thanked her too, meaning something else entirely. She hugged me in the parking lot afterward, burying her face in my shoulder, whispering how glad she was we were working through this. I patted her back and stared over her shoulder at a passing delivery truck, counting the seconds until I could get away from the smell of her perfume. The closest call came that same night. I was in my home office with the door half shut, going through Harold's red folder one more time under the desk lamp, when I heard Vivian's heels on the hardwood coming down the hall earlier than I expected. I had maybe 4 seconds. I slid the folder into the bottom drawer, closed it with my knee, and had a property tax bill from an old rental pulled up on the screen by the time she pushed the door open. "What are you working on?" she asked, leaning against the frame. Perfectly casual. "Just some year-end paperwork," I said, and turned the monitor slightly toward her, like I had nothing to hide, which is exactly what you do when you have everything to hide. "Boring stuff, you know how it is." She smiled, said something about not wanting to interrupt, and drifted back toward the bedroom. I sat there for a full minute afterward, with my heart going harder than it had in the boardroom itself. 3 weeks later, when it actually mattered. It's a strange thing being more afraid of a woman noticing a folder than of the folder's contents themselves. I understood in that minute exactly how close the whole plan had come to unraveling over something as small as a pair of shoes on a hallway floor. I drove out to the cemetery again the next afternoon, on my lunch break, still in my work clothes. I didn't say much to Eleanor that time. I just sat on the grass for 10 minutes with my hands loose in my lap, the way you sit next to someone when you don't need to fill the silence, and let it steady me before I went back to being a man who smiled at his own wife over dinner. The hammer came down the next morning while I was at the gym, hitting a heavy bag until my knuckles ached. "We've got it," Harold said when I picked up, and there was real adrenaline in his voice for the first time since this started. "Vivian, Preston, and Dominic are making their final pitch today at 11 a.m. The lender is a man named Walter Kingsley, old-school commercial lending, not someone who forgives sloppy paperwork. If he pulls his bridge funding today, Ridgeview goes into immediate default. They're meeting on the executive floor of the Ashford Grand downtown, Conference Room B. I checked my watch. 9:15. Vivian had kissed me goodbye an hour earlier, and told me she had an all-day seminar for a tech client. "She's managing a crisis, all right," I said. "Just not the one she's telling me about. Are our documents ready?" Every page, the certified deed, the prenup, the email chain, color copies for the room. A pause. "I wouldn't miss this for anything, Grant." "Meet me in the lobby at 10:45, I said. "If they get there early, don't let them see you. We walk in together." I drove home to an empty, silent house. I stood under the shower a long time, washing off the gym and something heavier that didn't come off as easily. I bypassed my usual jeans and pulled a charcoal suit out of the closet I hadn't worn since the wedding. A white shirt, a dark tie. I moved slowly. There was no rush left in me, only a strange, settled calm, the exact opposite of how I'd felt on that porch 4 days earlier. Eleanor and I hadn't spent 11 years building something so that a family of strangers could use my name as a line item on someone else's balance sheet. I drove downtown with the windows cracked, the skyline getting bigger the whole way, running through the numbers one more time out of habit. The deed, the prenup date, the 16 days, the $2,850,000, the $5 or $6 million they thought they were stealing against a real number more than 7 times that size. Numbers had always been the thing I trusted most in the world, more than people, if I'm honest, and for the first time in 11 days the numbers were entirely on my side, and I intended to let them do the talking. For the first time since the wedding, I felt something that wasn't dread. I felt ready. Harold was waiting by the stone pillars near the elevator banks when I walked into the lobby of the Ashford Grand, a reinforced leather case in one hand, looking like a man dressed for an execution he was fully prepared to carry out himself. "You ready for this?" he asked. "I've been ready since a 20-year-old checked his watch at my dining table," I said. "Let me go first," Harold said, quieter now, all business. "I lay out the documents. I let Kingsley read before anyone says a word about the number. You don't say anything about the actual figure until I tell you the room is ready for it. A reveal like that only lands once, and I want it landing on Kingsley's decision, not on Vivian's panic. Can you hold it?" "I can hold it," I said, and meant it. 11 years of closing negotiations had taught me at least that much. The person who talks first after the silence usually loses the silence. We rode up in silence. The 18th floor opened onto thick carpet, warm recessed lighting, abstract art that cost more than most people's cars. At the end of the hall, the double doors of Conference Room B stood open a few inches, and Dominic Calder's voice carried out into the corridor. Confident, booming, the practiced bravado of a salesman standing on a sinking deck. Harold and I stood outside those doors for maybe 10 seconds without moving. Long enough that I could hear my own pulse over the sound of Dominic's pitch. 10 seconds isn't very long in most parts of a life. It felt, standing there, like the last quiet room I'd ever get to stand in before everything on the other side of that gap became permanent. Through the gap I had a clean view of the room. A long mahogany table, Walter Kingsley at the head of it, silver-haired, somewhere in his 60s, flanked by 2 junior analysts typing without looking up. Across from him, Dominic stood gesturing at a slide-on-the-wall screen with a laser pointer. A big sun-weathered man in his 50s, with the kind of tan that comes from decades of walking job sites instead of vacations, wearing a suit one size too tight for however long ago he'd bought it. Preston sat beside him in a suit he definitely hadn't bought with his own money, and there, poised with a leather notebook, and that slim gold fountain pen resting beside it, sat my wife. And as outlined in the revised prospectus, Mr. Kingsley, Dominic was saying, the supply chain delays that stalled Ridgeview are fully resolved. We're bringing in substantial family liquidity to bridge this gap and guarantee your institution's first lien position. He clicked the remote. A photo of my house, my brick house, in Myers Park, the one Eleanor and I had remodeled by hand, filled the screen under the heading Additional Collateral. My associate has secured a fully unencumbered residential property, Dominic continued, in one of the strongest zip codes in the region. The equity covers the bridge requirement more than twice over. We're prepared to guarantee it. Kingsley steepled his fingers. He did not look impressed. I've heard promises of family liquidity before, Mr. Calder. It usually means a brother-in-law who might co-sign if he's feeling generous. Where's the actual owner of this property? Dominic glanced sideways at Vivian, the first genuine crack of nerves I'd seen through the gap in the door. My associate can speak to the ownership structure directly, Mr. Kingsley. She's... Vivian leaned forward, resting her forearms on the table, the picture of professional composure. My husband is fully on board with our financial strategy, Mr. Kingsley. The property is transitioning into Calder Family Holdings. I manage the entity personally. We had a minor scheduling delay with the notary this week, but the asset is effectively pledged. Grant prefers to stay out of boardrooms. He trusts my judgment completely. I didn't wait for another word. I pushed the doors open. They swung wide and hit the rubber stops with a sound like a small piece of artillery going off, and every head in the room turned at once. Vivian's face drained of color so fast I genuinely thought, for one absurd second, that she might faint. Her fountain pen slipped out of her fingers, clattered against the mahogany, and rolled off the edge onto the carpet. Dominic froze mid-gesture, laser pointer still aimed uselessly at the screen. Preston's mouth opened, and nothing came out. I'm sorry to interrupt, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. I must have missed the memo about pledging my late wife's house to save someone else's real estate project. I walked to the head of the table, Harold a step behind me, and set my hands flat on the wood. Mr. Kingsley, my name is Grant Whitfield. I'm the sole legal owner of the property being presented to you today. I'm here on the record to tell you that my home is not, has never been, and will never be available as collateral for this or any other project associated with these individuals. The room broke into noise all at once. Dominic slammed both palms on the table. Grant, what the hell are you doing here? This is a private meeting. You're trespassing. Get out of here. Preston was on his feet, face flushed dark. Call security, Mom. Tell him to get out. He's going to ruin everything. Vivian finally found her voice, half rising, one hand out toward me, across the table, legs visibly unsteady. Grant, honey, please, you don't understand what's happening. Let's step into the hallway, and I'll explain. Don't call me that, I said, and something in my tone made her stop mid-reach. We're a little past hallway conversations. You wanted to leverage my entire life behind my back in a boardroom, so here we are, in the boardroom. Harold stepped forward and opened his case on an empty chair, unhurried, the way a surgeon lays out instruments. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Mr. Kingsley, I'm Grant's attorney. This is a certified copy of the deed, proving sole, unencumbered ownership. He slid it across the table. This is the prenuptial agreement, executed prior to the marriage, explicitly barring the use of Grant's separate property to satisfy any debt or obligation belonging to his spouse or her associates. Kingsley picked both up, scanning fast, his face unreadable. And this, Harold said, laying down a single folded sheet, is a verified internal correspondence proving that Vivian Hale, Dominic Calder, and Preston Calder knowingly misrepresented access to this collateral in order to obtain financing from your institution. Dominic stared at the page like it might detonate. Preston looked like he might actually be sick on his own shoes. Kingsley read it slowly. I watched his eyes move down the page. Preston's question about whether Mom's guy was solid, Dominic's line about a grieving widower with no backbone, Vivian's closing note about how 5 or 6 million would be enough to save them all. When he finished, he set it down, took off his glasses and looked at Dominic with an expression I can only describe as professional death. Kingsley turned first, deliberately, to Vivian. "You told me your husband was fully on board," he said. "Your exact words were that he prefers to stay out of boardrooms because he trusts your judgment completely." He let that sit a moment, watching her face for an answer she didn't have. "He's standing in this boardroom right now telling me the opposite. Which one of you is lying to me, Miss Hale?" Vivian opened her mouth. Nothing came out of it. It was the first time in the entire time I'd known her that I'd seen her fail to produce a sentence. "Fraud," Kingsley said finally, turning back to the room at large. The word landed like a dropped glass. For a second, nobody in the room moved at all. Not the analysts, not Preston, not even Dominic, who stood there with the laser pointer still lit. A small red dot trembling slightly against the wall screen because his hand had started shaking and he hadn't noticed yet. "You brought me a fraudulent collateral pledge for a multi-million-dollar bridge loan," he went on. "Misrepresented ownership knowingly in writing. That's not incompetence, Mr. Calder. That's bad faith, and I don't do business in bad faith." "Mr. Kingsley, please, this is a misunderstanding. We have other avenues." Dominic's confidence had evaporated entirely, replaced by something sweating and small. "Shut your mouth," Kingsley said without raising his voice, and the room went dead silent. That's when Preston, entirely unable to control the impulse that had gotten him into this mess in the first place, turned his rage on me. "You selfish son of a—" he caught himself barely, in front of the room. "We're talking about an entire development. Contractors are waiting on paychecks. My dad's whole career is on the line, and you're throwing a tantrum because you're too paranoid to risk $5 million your dead wife left you. It's $5 million. You could fix all of this, and still be rich." The room went still in a different way. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I looked at Vivian, silently crying now, both hands pressed over her mouth like she could push the last few minutes back inside herself. "$5 million?" I asked quietly, almost conversationally. "Is that what you told them, Vivian? Is that what you actually thought you were stealing?" I turned back to Preston. "My late wife didn't leave me $5 million. I let that sit exactly as long as it needed to. Between what she left me and what I've built since, my net worth is a little over $43 million. Nobody breathed. Preston made a sound like he'd swallowed his own tongue. Dominic actually staggered back a step, bumping the presentation screen hard enough to tilt it. And Vivian just stared at me, and for the first time since I'd met her, I watched every practiced expression fall off her face at once, replaced by something raw and unrehearsed. The specific horror of realizing she'd spent a year running a con on a fortune large enough to make the con completely unnecessary. She hadn't just lost a $2 million bridge loan. She'd lost an empire she could have simply been given. Even Kingsley's 2 junior analysts had stopped typing. One of them glanced sideways at her boss. An unreadable, professional flicker of a look that I understood perfectly, because I'd worn that exact expression myself, years earlier. The first time I watched a deal collapse in real time across a conference table, Kingsley didn't look at either of them. He was still watching me, and something in his stern, appraising face had shifted from suspicion into something closer to respect. The specific respect one careful, numbers-driven man extends to another once he understands who actually built the thing everyone else had been lying about. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. I reached down, picked up her fountain pen from where it had rolled against the table leg, and set it gently back down in front of her, capped, upright, exactly where it had been before it fell. The same small, ordinary courtesy I'd have shown her 18 months earlier, before any of this, without thinking twice about it. I didn't say anything while I did it. There was nothing left to accuse her of that the room hadn't already heard. Then I reached over, closed Dominic's presentation folder where it sat open on the table, and slid it back toward him. The cardboard made the exact same flat final sound it had made on my own dining room table 4 days earlier. "This meeting is over," Kingsley said, standing, buttoning his jacket. "Mr. Calder, you're in breach and in default. I'll begin foreclosure proceedings on Ridgeview by end of day, and I'll be forwarding this correspondence to our legal team for a fraud referral. Don't contact my office again." He and his analysts gathered their laptops and walked out without looking at any of us twice. I turned and followed them toward the door. I didn't look back at the wreckage on my way out. I'd already seen everything in that room I needed to see. We hadn't made it 10 feet toward the elevators when the doors burst open behind us. Harold glanced at me sideways as we walked, checking, in his own quiet way, whether I needed a second before whatever came next. "You good?" he asked. "I will be," I said, which was as honest an answer as I had in me at that particular moment. Grant, please, wait." Vivian caught up in her heels, mascara already tracking down her face, grabbing my sleeve with both hands. I stopped walking, but didn't turn my head. "Please, let me explain." Dominic threatened me. He said if I didn't help secure the collateral, he'd drag Preston into his own bankruptcy, ruin his credit before he even had any. "I'm his mother, Grant. I was trying to protect my son. I never wanted to hurt you. I was trapped." I looked down at her hand on my arm, then up into her eyes. "You sat at my kitchen table," I said. "Ate food I paid for, slept in the room where my first wife took her last breath. And told me you loved me every single morning, while texting your ex-husband about how easy I'd be to move. That's not a woman who got trapped. That's a plan that got interrupted." "I do love you," she said, and I believed, in that moment, that some small percentage of it might even be true, buried under everything else. The money, the project, it got out of hand. But what we have is real. You heard Kingsley. You have $43 million, Grant. We could pay off Dominic's debt today, and still have a life together. It was, I thought, a genuinely remarkable sentence. An offer to keep loving me, priced, apparently, at whatever it costs to bail out her ex-husband first. "Let go of my arm, Vivian." Something in the way I said it made her drop her hand immediately, stepping back like she'd touched a stove. Preston came jogging out of the conference room next, Dominic trailing behind him, gray and hollowed out. Preston wasn't crying, he was furious, the entitlement I'd mistaken for confidence still fully intact, even as his family's finances evaporated in real time. "You can't just walk away from us," he said, stepping into my path, chest out like it might still work on me. "You have $43 million sitting in accounts, and you're going to let my dad lose everything over $3 million? What kind of person does that? You were supposed to be family." "I was family," I said, "for about 3 days, until you showed up on my porch to remind me I wasn't." "The kind whose backup plan turned out to be an actual human being," I added, and stepped around him toward the elevator. The doors closed on Vivian's last wailing sob. Harold and I rode down in silence, and somewhere around the 10th floor, I realized my hands weren't shaking anymore. I called Renee from the parking garage before I even started the truck. "It's done," I said, and that was almost all I could get out for a second. She didn't ask for details right away. She just said, "Good," in the flat, relieved voice of someone who'd been braced for a different phone call for weeks, and told me she was booking a flight for the weekend whether I asked her to or not. I told her that sounded about right. I didn't go home that night. I checked into a hotel, and the next morning, Harold filed for divorce under the terms of the prenup, along with a formal notice attaching the email chain as an exhibit, a move he described, with visible satisfaction, as making sure the record speaks before she gets a chance to. Because of the documented fraud, the process moved fast. No courtroom battle, no division of assets, no alimony, no discovery fight, because there was nothing left to discover that Harold hadn't already put in a binder 3 weeks earlier. Vivian's own attorney called Harold once, tried to negotiate a settlement anyway, and got exactly 4 words in reply before Harold hung up. "Read the prenup again." It was, start to finish, the cleanest, most heavily paper-trailed severing of a marriage either of us had ever seen, and Harold had seen a lot of them. The whole thing was finalized in 61 days. A marriage that had lasted 3, undone in a fraction of the time it takes most banks to close on a standard mortgage. I gave Vivian 48 hours to collect her things from the house, with 2 security guards standing at the front door the entire time, there as much to keep an inventory as to keep the peace. She tried, on the second day, to walk out with a small landscape painting that had hung in my front hallway since before I met her. One of the few things of Eleanor's I'd kept displayed, a watercolor of the coast she'd bought on our first anniversary trip. One of the guards stopped her at the door and asked politely whether that particular piece was on the list of items she'd claimed as hers. She said it had been a gift to the house, which wasn't true, and set it back down on the hall table without meeting my eyes when she said it. It was such a small, almost pointless theft, the painting was worth maybe $400, that it told me more about who she really was than the $43 million ever had. She left a long, tear-stained letter on the kitchen island on her way out for the last time. I threw it in the trash without breaking the seal. Renee flew in that Friday, exactly as promised, and spent most of the weekend doing the specific, undramatic work of just being present. Grocery shopping, refilling the fridge with things that weren't takeout, sitting with me on the back patio in the evenings without needing either of us to fill the silence with commentary. She didn't say "I told you so" once, the entire weekend, which from Renee was its own quiet act of mercy. On Sunday, before her flight, she stood in the kitchen doorway and asked if I was going to be all right. I told her I honestly didn't know yet, and that not knowing felt more honest than promising her I was fine. She said that was the first completely believable thing I'd said to her in over a year, and I understood exactly what she meant by it. I had one more loose end. I invited Trevor to a steakhouse downtown, the kind of place with white tablecloths and a wine list heavier than the menu. He showed up jovial, ordered a top-shelf scotch before he'd even sat down, and asked how married life was treating me, clearly still unaware that a bomb had gone off 18 floors above the city 3 days earlier. I set a thin folder on the tablecloth next to his steak. I didn't touch my own plate. "Harold's investigator found a wire transfer," I said, watching him chew, oblivious to what was coming. $52,000. From a shell account connected to Dominic Calder, landing in your account 3 days after I signed the prenup. Trevor stopped chewing. The color left his face fast enough that he looked almost gray under the restaurant's warm lighting. "Grant, listen, let me explain. You sold my grief for $52,000. I said quietly. "You found a lonely widower who trusted you, and you handed him to a family of predators for a commission." "I didn't know they were going to try to take your house," he said, pushing his plate away, appetite gone. "Dominic told me they needed a silent investor, said she was a good woman looking for a second chance. I thought it was a win for everybody. I swear to God, Grant, I didn't know about the LLC." "Would it have mattered?" I asked. "If you'd known?" He didn't answer that one, which was its own answer. Somewhere behind his eyes, I watched him do the math on $52,000 one more time, and come up, once again, willing to have looked the other way. "You're a broker for parasites," I said, standing, adjusting my tie. "I've already forwarded the wire records to the district attorney's office. They're very interested in how Dominic Calder finds his investors, and who delivers them." I dropped 2 20s on the table to cover my untouched water. "If I ever see you near my house, or my business again, I won't need a lawyer." I walked out and left him sitting in the booth, sweating under lights that suddenly seemed too bright for him. I spent the next couple of weeks fielding some version of the same question from nearly everyone I knew. Colleagues, old college contacts, a couple of Eleanor's former business partners who still checked in a few times a year. "What happened?" they'd ask, careful and a little wide-eyed, since a divorce 12 days after a wedding tends to travel fast in a mid-sized city. I settled on one honest short version and repeated it without much elaboration. I found out quickly that I'd married into a financial situation I hadn't agreed to, and I handled it the way I handle everything else that shows up unannounced with a folder full of paperwork. Most people nodded and let it go at that. A few pushed for details I didn't give them. Nobody, notably, defended Vivian once they heard even that much, which told me something about how thin her public performance had actually been all along, once there was finally a reason to look past it. Within 3 months, Ridgeview Commons collapsed completely. The bank foreclosed, seized what collateral existed, and auctioned the half-finished property to a competing developer for a fraction of what Dominic had sunk into it. Dominic himself filed for bankruptcy, a filing complicated by the fact that Vivian had co-signed several of the earlier bridge loans, in a bid to prove her loyalty to him during the scramble. He lost the development firm entirely, and the last I heard from Walt Pretty, he was working under someone else's license as a project manager on a job site 2 counties over, taking direction from men half his age who had no idea he'd once run his own company. Her personal accounts were frozen and drained by creditors within weeks. She sold her car, gave up her downtown apartment, and moved into a small rental on the industrial edge of the city. I heard, secondhand, through Renee, that Rosalind refused to help her with even the security deposit, on the grounds that Vivian should have gotten it in writing before the wedding, not 16 days before it. The exact doctrine she'd spent 30 years drilling into her daughter, now being used as a reason to withhold the very safety net that doctrine had supposedly been about. It was a strange, sour kind of poetry. The lesson had outlived any warmth behind it, on both ends of that particular family line. Desmond Voss fared no better. The state bar opened an inquiry into his role, drafting the LLC paperwork once Harold's fraud referral named him directly. And though he was never criminally charged, he'd been careful, in his own nervous way, To keep his own hands technically clean, he lost enough clients over the association that he closed his small practice within the year, and took a compliance job at an insurance company 2 states away, drafting policy language instead of collateral pledges. I never heard from him again, which struck me as the appropriate ending for a man whose main personality trait, in the one afternoon I knew him, had been shifting his weight uncomfortably on other people's porches. Preston's promising start in finance ended before it began. The fraud referral made his name radioactive in local real estate circles. No firm within 300 miles would touch him. His girlfriend, Chloe, left within a month of the money drying up. Renee heard, through a mutual friend, that she'd told Preston flatly she hadn't signed up to date somebody's downfall, packed 2 suitcases while he was at a job interview that didn't pan out, and was already dating a dental student by the following spring. Last I heard, he was working a shift job at a car rental counter on the edge of town, wearing a polyester uniform instead of a suit he hadn't paid for, answering to a manager who had no idea and no interest in who his father used to be. I actually saw him once, about 8 months after the boardroom, returning a rental car near the airport for a closing trip I hadn't bothered to reschedule around him. He was behind the counter when I walked in, and I watched the recognition hit him in stages. First just a customer, then the particular customer, then the full weight of exactly which customer. He didn't say anything smart. He didn't say anything entitled. He just processed my return, said, "Have a good flight," in a flat, professional voice that had clearly had all the fight worn out of it, and slid my receipt across the counter without quite meeting my eyes. I didn't gloat. There was nothing left in me that wanted to. I just said thank you, took the receipt, and walked to my gate, and that was the last time I ever saw anyone from that family in person. They'd walked up to what they thought was a fragile piggy bank and tried to pry it open. It turned out to be a vault. And the vault came down on all 3 of them at once. Walter Kingsley's office called mine about 6 weeks later. Not about Ridgeview, which was already dead, but to ask, through an assistant, whether I'd have any interest in reviewing a mixed-use deal his bank was underwriting on the other side of town. I hadn't asked for the referral. I hadn't done anything to earn it, except tell the truth clearly in a room full of people who weren't. I took the meeting, mostly out of curiosity, and Kingsley shook my hand like a man greeting a colleague instead of a victim, which was, in its own quiet way, one of the more useful compliments I'd gotten in 2 years. The last time I saw Harold on business specific to Vivian, he closed his red folder, the same one, still slightly warped from being carried around for weeks, set it on the corner of his desk, and told me the file was officially closed. Nothing left open, nothing left owed. In my world, closing is the word you use for the exact moment ownership actually transfers, the moment all the paperwork stops being a threat and starts being a fact. Harold used the word on purpose. I understood exactly what he meant by it, and for the first time in months, so did I. For a long stretch, after the divorce was finalized, I didn't struggle with missing Vivian. I didn't miss her for a single day. What I struggled with was the humiliation of how easily my own loneliness had made me an easy target. I got suspicious of everything. If someone bought me a coffee, I wondered what they wanted back. If someone complimented the house, I looked for the angle underneath it. A neighbor, an older widow named Constance, who'd lived 2 doors down for 15 years, brought over a casserole about a month after the news got around, the way neighbors do. And I stood in my own doorway running through, in real time, exactly what she might want from me, before I managed to shut that instinct down long enough to just say thank you. She wanted nothing. She'd made an extra casserole and thought of a man who lived alone. It took me embarrassingly long that year to remember that most people are simply what they appear to be, and that treating everyone like Vivian was its own way of letting her keep something from me long after she was gone. I was letting what Vivian did to me poison the exact financial freedom Eleanor and I had spent our 20s sacrificing for. It showed up in small, unglamorous ways. I had a second deadbolt installed, then a camera system with more cameras than the house actually needed. I checked the locks twice most nights, sometimes a third time around 2 in the morning, standing in the dark hallway in bare feet feeling faintly ridiculous and unable to stop anyway. I started seeing a counselor myself, a quiet, unhurried man named Dr. Okafor. Mostly because Renee finally told me, without much patience left in her voice, that surviving a con doesn't automatically make you insightful about your own damage, it just makes you defensive about it. I went twice a month for the better part of a year. It didn't fix anything on a schedule. It just gave the fixing somewhere to happen other than alone, at midnight, staring at a portfolio spreadsheet. Somewhere in one of those sessions, I told Dr. Okafor that I'd spent my whole career underwriting properties before I'd ever touched them. Soil reports, title searches, inspections, every hidden liability accounted for before a single dollar changed hands. And that I'd walked into a marriage without running a single one of those checks on the actual person. He didn't offer me a neat therapeutic reframe back, he just asked what an inspection would have even looked like. For a person instead of a building. I sat with that question longer than I sat with most of what he said that year. I still don't have a clean answer. The closest I've gotten is that you can't inspect a person the way you inspect a house, but you can watch what they do the first time they think no one's checking the foundation. And that tells you almost everything the paperwork can't. Harold finally said something about the rest of it on a rainy afternoon months later, while I sat in his office staring at a portfolio spreadsheet that meant nothing to me. You need to actually do something with this money, he said, leaning back. You're hoarding it like a dragon in a cave. Eleanor didn't work 80-hour weeks so you could sit alone and stare at bank statements until you die. He was right, and I knew it the second he said it. Eleanor had always been a builder. She loved creating opportunities for people willing to work for them. That week, I contacted a state university and set up the Eleanor Whitfield Memorial Scholarship Fund with $3 million. The exact figure Dominic and Vivian had needed to save their project, redirected somewhere it might actually do some good. I didn't design it for ambitious 20-year-olds who assumed the world owed them a shortcut. I set the eligibility for working women 35 and older. Women who'd put their own education on hold to raise kids, care for a sick parent, or claw their way out of a bad marriage, and who wanted a second run at community college or a trade certification. I picked 35 specifically because that's roughly how old Eleanor was the year our fourplex finally turned a real profit. The year she stopped doing bookkeeping on the side and started doing it because she loved the math itself. She never got a formal degree in any of it. She was entirely self-taught, stubborn, and starting from exactly nothing, the same starting line most of these women were standing on when the scholarship letter reached them. It felt less like charity, and more like paying forward the specific kind of late start that had built my entire life, aimed at women the world had already quietly written off as too old to bother investing in. Signing that paperwork, giving away millions of dollars entirely by my own choice, was the first time, since Eleanor died, that the money had felt like mine again, instead of just a number I was protecting. There's a real difference between opening your hand to give something and having someone reach into your pocket to take it. The first cohort was 11 women. I made a point of going to the small reception the university held that spring, uncomfortable in a blazer. Mostly there to shake hands and leave, before anyone asked me to make a speech I hadn't prepared. The dean introduced me from a small podium as a benefactor who wished to keep the focus on the recipients rather than himself, which was exactly the arrangement I'd asked for. And I stood near the back with a cup of bad coffee, feeling more useful than I had in 2 years of expensive suits and worse decisions. A woman named Adele Marsh found me by the coffee table instead. She was 41, had spent 19 years managing a diner counter after leaving nursing school to care for a father with dementia, and was 3 weeks into a medical billing certificate she'd assumed, until the scholarship letter arrived, she'd never be able to afford. She thanked me for about 30 seconds before she started crying in a way that had nothing performed about it at all, nothing like the tears I'd spent a year learning to distrust. She apologized for crying. I told her she didn't owe me an apology for anything, and I meant it more plainly than I'd meant most sentences in the last 2 years combined. I kept the thank you card she mailed afterward in the same desk drawer where I used to keep Harold's red folder, different kind of paperwork entirely. The fund's grown since that first reception, 34 women now, across 2 community colleges and a trade school that runs HVAC and electrical certifications. Adele finished her billing certificate in 11 months, and now trains new hires at the same clinic that employed her. Every spring the university sends me a short update, a page or two, names and programs and completion rates, and I read every single one at the kitchen island with actual coffee instead of the wine I used to need to get through paperwork with Vivian's name on it. It is, without question, the best use I have ever made of a single dollar Eleanor and I earned together, and neither of us built any of it thinking that's what it would eventually be for. A few months after that reception, an envelope showed up in my mailbox from Vivian's new address on the industrial side of town. I let it sit on the counter for 3 days before curiosity finally won. The letter ran 6 pages, in her looping handwriting. She didn't ask for money, She didn't ask me to take her back. She didn't even try to blame Dominic anymore. She wrote that losing everything had forced her to look in the mirror without the PR spin she'd built her whole career on. She admitted that when we first met at Trevor's dinner party, she genuinely liked me. That it was only once Ridgeview started bleeding cash that she began looking at my grief less as something to comfort, and more as leverage she happened to have access to. Then she wrote something I read 4 or 5 times, the ink slightly smudged where a tear had landed on it. I turned your loneliness into my financial contingency plan, and in doing it, I destroyed the only real security I've ever had in my life. A page later, she wrote that she'd give back every dollar Ridgeview had ever touched. If it existed to give back, just to undo the specific memory of my face in that boardroom doorway. I believe that part less than the rest of it. It's easy to say you'd trade money you no longer have for a moment you can't undo. It costs you nothing to offer. Near the end of the letter, almost as an afterthought, she wrote about her mother. About how Rosalind, decades earlier, had been left with absolutely nothing when Vivian's father walked out on their marriage, and remarried within the year. The family's only rental property had been titled solely in his name, and Rosalind had spent years fighting for scraps of it, in court, and losing, again and again, because she'd never once put her own name on anything. Nobody had ever told Rosalind that what happened to her was unfair. She just absorbed it as a lesson, and spent the next 30 years teaching her daughter to weaponize it instead of grieve it. Get it in writing before the ring, Vivian wrote, was something her mother had said to her before she'd even finished high school. It didn't excuse anything. It did, finally, explain the strange bitterness I'd noticed at that Thanksgiving table years earlier, and never understood. I didn't reply to the letter. I took it out to the back patio, lit the corner with a match, and watched 6 pages curl, blacken, and scatter into the yard on the evening wind. Some things don't need an answer. They just need to be finished. About a year after the divorce, Renee finally talked me into letting her set me up again. A woman named Iris who taught middle school science and had absolutely no interest in real estate, portfolios, or anything to do with what I did for a living. Our first dinner she asked about my week instead of my net worth, and when I mentioned, carefully, that I'd been married before, twice actually, she didn't flinch, and she didn't reach for my hand across the table either. She just asked what Eleanor had been like, and then separately, what had happened with the second one. Like they were 2 different questions that deserved 2 different kinds of attention, instead of one smooth transition designed to make me feel comfortable. We dated for about 4 months. It didn't work out, nothing dramatic, we just wanted different paces of life, and she was honest enough to say so before either of us wasted more time pretending otherwise. We stayed friendly enough afterward that she still texts me every August. When school starts back up, a photo of her new classroom with some variation of the same joke about how at least her students can't file an LLC against her yet. But something about those 4 months mattered anyway. I found out I could still tell the difference between someone listening to understand me, and someone listening to catalog me, and that the difference was obvious now in a way it hadn't been before Vivian taught me, expensively, what to listen for. Dr. Okafor called that progress. In the dry, unimpressed way he called most things progress. I believed him. It's been a little over 2 years now since that Tuesday morning on my porch. I'm 39. I still live in the same brick house in Myers Park. The one Eleanor and I bought and remodeled with our own hands. The one 2 separate people once tried to talk me out of. I didn't move. I wasn't going to let Vivian's ghost chase me out of a house I'd already paid for twice, once in money, once in grief. I did finally finish the window seat. It took me most of a Saturday, longer than it should have, because I kept stopping to just look at the studs I'd framed 4 years earlier and left standing half-built behind a drop cloth. The lumber had gone a little gray with dust, but it was all still sound. I sanded it down, ran the trim, set the cushion into place, the same pale blue fabric Eleanor had actually picked out from a catalog years before she got sick, still folded in a box in the hall closet, waiting for a room that hadn't existed yet when she chose it. I sat there with a cup of coffee the first morning it was finished, looking out at the same backyard oak she'd wanted to look out at, and it didn't feel like closure exactly. It felt more like paying off a debt I'd been carrying so long I'd almost forgotten it was a debt at all. Renee came down for a weekend not long after and sat in it before I even had a chance to show it off properly, coffee in hand, feet up, entirely unbothered by the 2 years it had taken me to get around to 4 hours of carpentry. "It's good, you know," she said, not looking up from her mug, "that you finished it." I told her I knew. I didn't need to explain what it meant. She'd been in the room in one way or another since before I did. I still see Dr. Okafor once a month now instead of twice, mostly to talk through ordinary things, work, the occasional date, the slow, unglamorous business of staying a person who trusts appropriately, instead of a person who either trusts nobody, or trusts the wrong people spectacularly. He told me once that the goal was never to stop being capable of being fooled. It was to get faster at noticing when the numbers on somebody's story stopped adding up. I've gotten faster, not perfect. Faster. A few weeks ago, on a bright Sunday morning, I went to a small cafe downtown, the kind with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu, and took a table by the window. I ordered black coffee, eggs, toast, and opened the paper the old-fashioned way, on actual newsprint, because some habits from a slower version of my life stuck around on purpose. The waitress, a college student, name tag that said Priya, a coffee pot balanced in one hand, came by to refill my mug and noticed the empty chair across from me, the extra place setting nobody had asked her to clear. "Are you waiting on someone?" she asked, not unkindly, just making conversation the way you do with a regular. There was a version of me, a few years back, right after Eleanor died, for whom that question would have landed like a gut punch. A small, innocent reminder of exactly how much space one person's absence can take up in a room. Then Vivian came along, and for a while I actually believed that filling the empty chair was the same thing as healing the hole underneath it. I know better now. Filling a chair with the wrong person doesn't heal anything. It just adds a second problem sitting on top of the first one. Eleanor once told me, near the very end, not to let the house get quiet forever. I think about that instruction more than almost anything else she ever said to me. I don't think she meant fill it with the first warm body that walks through the door. I think she meant keep it a place worth living in, noisy with the right things, quiet in the ways that are actually peace instead of absence. It took me a very expensive detour to learn the difference. I don't plan on forgetting it again. I looked at the empty seat for a second. I thought about the quiet in the house that didn't feel like loneliness anymore. Most days, it felt like a room with good bones and nobody currently trying to remortgage it out from under me. I thought about 11 women a year working toward a second chance they'd stopped believing they'd get. I thought about a window seat that took 2 years and 4 hours to finish, in that order, and how neither number was wrong. "No," I told her, and smiled, and meant it all the way down. "Just me today." She nodded, cleared the extra silverware, and left me to my coffee and my paper in the morning light. I walked home instead of driving, the long way, past the elementary school and the little park with the oaks that always reminded me of my own backyard. Charlotte was doing the thing it does in early fall, the light going gold and slanted by mid-morning, and I found myself thinking, without any of the old dread attached to it, about how much of my life Eleanor had built the foundation for without ever getting to see the finished rooms. The scholarship, the window seat. Even, in some strange roundabout way, my own ability to recognize a bad deal when it finally sat down across from me wearing someone else's kindness as a disguise. None of it would exist without 11 years of her stubbornness. I don't think that debt ever fully closes. I've stopped expecting it to. I stopped by the hardware store on the way, on impulse, and picked up a small brass plate to screw into the finished window seat. The kind people usually use to label mailboxes or dedicate library benches. I had it engraved with just her initials and the year we bought the house. It's a small thing. It took the clerk about 10 minutes to cut. I mounted it that same afternoon, on the underside of the seat where you'd only ever find it if you were looking, which felt like exactly the right amount of visibility for something that private. For most of my life I thought trust meant handing someone the keys to everything and hoping they didn't total the car. I don't believe that anymore. Real trust isn't about how much access you give somebody up front. It's about what they do, the one time they realize you weren't watching closely enough to notice if they took something. Vivian failed that test on day 3. Eleanor would have failed it never, and I only fully understood the difference once I'd been forced to watch someone fail it in real time. At my own dining room table, over a folder with my name conspicuously absent from it. If someone in your life has ever mistaken your grief for a soft place to land a bad deal, or your kindness for a signature waiting to happen, I want to hear about it. Tell me what happened in the comments, and if this story meant something to you, do me a favor. Hit like, subscribe if you haven't already, and share it with somebody who needs to hear that walking away from people like this isn't losing your family. It's finally getting an accurate appraisal of what your family was actually worth. Thank you for sitting with me through this one. I'll see you in the next story. A house doesn't fall because of the storm that finally knocks it down. It falls because somebody skipped the inspection on the one wall holding everything else up. And by the time you hear it creak, the smartest thing you can do isn't shore up the wall. It's find out, calmly and completely, who built it that way on purpose.